The evening sun was sinking slowly behind the Arizona hills, painting the wide prairie in shades of gold and red. The land looked endless, stretching far in every direction with only a few dry bushes and rocks breaking the emptiness. The air was dry, the kind of air that made a man's throat feel like dust if he stayed too long without water. A lone cowboy rode across this land, guiding his tired horse step by step. His name was Daniel, and for weeks he had been away on a cattle roundup with other ranch hands. Now, after long days of hard work and lonely nights, he was finally making his way back to his small ranch, where silence usually welcomed him. Daniel was not a man of many words. Life had taught him to trust his eyes more than his tongue. He wore a wide hat to keep the sun off his face, boots with dust on them, and an old coat that showed the wear of many seasons. His only steady companion was his horse, a strong chestnut mare named Clara. As the horse trotted forward, Daniel's eyes scanned the horizon as they always did. Out here, a man could never be too careful. Danger could come from bandits, wild animals, or even storms rolling in faster than one could prepare for. That evening, though, it was something else that caught his attention. At first, he thought it was nothing but a shadow among the rocks near the edge of a dried riverbed. But then Clara's ears pricked up and Daniel leaned forward, narrowing his eyes. The shape moved, slow, unsteady. It wasn't an animal. It was a person. He slowed his horse and approached carefully. Lying near the cracked riverbed was a woman. She looked weak, her long dark hair tangled and dusty, her feet bare and scraped. She was dressed in rough cloth that told Daniel she was no settler's wife or daughter. The patterns on the cloth, the beads hanging loosely on her neck, and the copper tone of her skin spoke clearly. She was Apache. Daniel froze for a moment. In his life, he had seen clashes between settlers and Apache tribes. He had heard stories in town, some told with fear, some with anger, and others with admiration for their strength. The truth was often twisted in stories, but one thing was certain. Relations between white men and Apache were filled with tension. Bringing one into his life could bring trouble, that much he knew. The woman looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear and desperation. She tried to speak, but her lips were dry and the words broke like fragile twigs in the wind. Daniel jumped down from his horse, his boots pressing against the cracked earth, and knelt beside her. "You all right?" he asked in a low voice, though he already knew the answer. The woman shook her head weakly. Her breath came in short gasps, and her body trembled as if she hadn't eaten in days. She whispered something in broken English, the words carrying a plea. "Please, don't leave me. I have nowhere to go." Daniel pulled the small water flask from his saddle and held it to her lips. She drank slowly as if each drop was precious. After a while, some color returned to her face, but her eyes still held a heavy sadness. "Where are your people?" Daniel asked, keeping his voice calm. She looked away, down at the ground. For a long time, she didn't answer. Then she said softly, "They don't want me." Her voice cracked, and Daniel could tell she carried a weight far heavier than thirst or hunger. Daniel sat back on his heels, unsure what to do. Every thought told him to ride on. This was none of his business. If he took her with him, he would face questions, suspicion, maybe even anger from the neighbors who already watched him with curious eyes. A cowboy living alone was easy enough for people to talk about. Bringing an Apache woman to his ranch, that would stir more than talk. But as he looked at her, her bare feet, the dirt smeared on her arms, the way she clutched herself as though the wind alone might push her away, he couldn't bring himself to leave. "Can you walk?" he asked. She tried, but her legs shook and she sank back down. Daniel sighed and glanced at Clara, who stood quietly, waiting for his decision. Finally, with a deep breath, he lifted the woman gently in his arms. She was lighter than he expected, fragile like a bird. He placed her on the horse's back, steadying her carefully before climbing up behind. As they rode slowly toward his ranch, the prairie seemed even more silent than before. The woman leaned back slightly, her head resting against his chest, her body too weak to sit upright on her own. Daniel could feel the uncertainty stirring inside him. Who was she really? Why had her own people turned her away? And what would happen once he brought her to his land? When the small ranch house finally came into view, standing alone against the fading light, Daniel felt both relief and worry. He had built that place with his own two hands, piece by piece, hoping for peace and a life of his own. But now, for the first time in years, someone else would cross its threshold. He helped her down from the horse and guided her inside. The little cabin was simple, Wooden walls, a small stove, a single bed, and a table with 2 chairs. He sat her by the fire, wrapped a blanket around her, and gave her a bit of bread from his supplies. She ate slowly, each bite careful and grateful. For a long while they didn't speak. The crackle of the fire filled the silence. Daniel leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching her. She was different from the women he had seen in town, different in a way that stirred something unspoken in him, not just her looks, but the quiet strength in her eyes, even in weakness. Finally, she whispered, "Thank you." Her voice was faint, but clear enough to reach him. Daniel gave a small nod. "You can stay here tonight, tomorrow. We'll figure out what comes next." She lowered her head, but Daniel caught the faint trace of relief in her expression. As she lay down near the warmth of the fire, he wondered how his life had suddenly shifted in the space of one evening. A lone cowboy who had thought his days would pass in silence now found himself with an unexpected guest, an Apache woman with a story she had yet to tell. Outside, the prairie stretched on under the stars. Inside the cabin, 2 lives that had once walked different paths now crossed in a way neither could have imagined. Daniel didn't know what the days ahead would bring, but deep in his chest he felt a quiet sense that something important had just begun. Morning sunlight slipped through the cracks of the small wooden cabin. Daniel stirred awake to the smell of smoke from the fire that had burned through the night. He had slept lightly, half listening for sounds of trouble outside, half watching over the woman who had collapsed in his arms the evening before. Now she sat quietly near the fire, wrapping the blanket tightly around herself, her face half hidden by her long black hair. She looked stronger than yesterday, but still carried a sadness that no rest could take away. Daniel rose slowly, stretching the stiffness from his back. He poured water into a tin cup and handed it to her. She accepted it with both hands, her fingers shaking as if she was not used to kindness. After she drank, he asked, "How are you feeling today?" She nodded once. "Better." Her English was broken but clear enough. Daniel gave a short nod. He was not a man of many questions, but his mind was full of them. Who was she running from? Why had her own people abandoned her? And what would happen if someone from town saw her here? He prepared a simple breakfast of beans and bread. She ate in silence, her eyes watching him as if she still could not believe he had not turned her away. After a long pause, she whispered, "My name is Ayana." The way she spoke, it carried pride, as though the name held the spirit of her ancestors. Daniel let the name roll through his mind. Ayana. It suited her, soft, yet strong. "I'm Daniel," he said plainly. For a moment they sat without speaking, listening to the wind press against the cabin walls. Daniel felt the strangeness of the situation. For years he had lived alone, with only his horse and the wide land as his company. Now, in the space of one night, someone else was sitting at his table sharing his food, her presence changing the rhythm of his world. Later that day, Ayana insisted on helping. She stood shakily at first, then gathered herself. She took to the tasks of the cabin as if she had always belonged there, sweeping the floor with the old broom, folding the blanket neatly, and stepping outside to bring water from the barrel. Daniel watched quietly. He had expected her to stay weak and rest, but she carried herself with dignity, even in her fragile state. When Daniel went to tend the horses, Ayana followed. She moved carefully around Clara, stroking the mare's neck with a gentleness that surprised him. Horses could sense fear, yet Clara stood calm under her touch. Ayana smiled faintly for the first time, a smile that softened the weight in her eyes. "You know horses," Daniel said. "My father raised many," she replied, her voice carrying a shadow of memory. That evening, Daniel rode into town for supplies. He had planned to leave Ayana at the cabin, but she looked at him with quiet fear when he stood at the door. "You go, come back?" she asked, her voice trembling as though she feared being abandoned again. "I'll come back," Daniel said firmly. "Stay here. You'll be safe." The ride into town felt heavier than usual. Daniel knew that small towns carried sharp eyes and sharper tongues. Already some neighbors wondered why he lived so far from everyone else. If they learned he was sheltering an Apache woman, the gossip would turn into anger. He bought what he needed, flour, salt, a bit of dried meat, and kept his head low. But even so, he caught whispers as he passed, half-spoken words about Indians and trouble in the hills. By the time he returned to the ranch, night had fallen. The cabin glowed faintly from the fire inside. Ayanna sat by the table, mending an old shirt of his with neat, careful stitches. Daniel felt something stir in his chest at the sight. She did not sit idle. She gave back in small ways, though she owed him nothing. The days turned into weeks. Slowly, the rhythm of life at the cabin changed. Ayanna rose early with Daniel, preparing food while he checked the cattle. She learned how to grind corn into meal, how to patch fences, and how to set snares for rabbits in the brush. Daniel, in turn, began to listen when she spoke softly of the land, the best way to follow the wind, how to read the sky for rain, how to hear danger in the sudden silence of birds. At first, their conversations were broken, shaped by her limited English and his few Apache words learned from traders. But little by little, they built a bridge of understanding. Daniel began to realize that while she came from a world different than his, she carried wisdom that was just as real, just as valuable. Yet not everyone would see it that way. Word reached Daniel one afternoon when he rode into town again. A rancher named Harris leaned against the store counter, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "I heard strange tracks near Daniel's land," Harris said. "Don't look like a man's boots. More like moccasins." Laughter followed, sharp and mocking. Daniel kept his face still, but inside he burned. He said nothing, paid for his supplies, and left. He knew then that whispers were growing. People would come asking questions sooner or later. Back at the cabin, he found Ayanna weaving strands of grass into a small mat. She looked up and saw the tightness in his face. "They know?" she asked quietly, reading his silence. "Maybe," Daniel answered. "But it doesn't matter. Let them talk." She looked down at her hands. "It matters. For you." Daniel did not answer. He knew she was right. But he also knew something else. He could not turn her away now. That night, as the fire flickered low, Ayanna sat across from him. Her voice broke the silence. "Why you help me?" she asked. Daniel thought for a long time before replying. "Because you needed someone, and because I couldn't ride away." Her eyes softened, and for the first time he saw tears shine. She turned her face to the fire so he would not see, but Daniel noticed. In that moment he realized her strength was not only in how she survived, but in how deeply she felt. The days continued, each one drawing them closer in ways they did not speak aloud. The ranch was no longer silent. Where once Daniel had returned from work to nothing but the crackle of fire, now he found the quiet sound of her humming, the smell of food she cooked, or the sight of her stitching patterns into cloth with careful hands. But the whispers from town grew louder, and Daniel knew that soon they would face a choice. The prairie was wide, but news traveled fast. Neighbors who once only passed by with a nod might soon come with questions, or worse, with demands. For now, though, he pushed the thought aside. He let the peace of the moment settle over him. The cowboy who had once lived with nothing but silence now found himself sharing laughter, rare, quiet laughter, with a woman who had been left behind by both worlds. And though neither spoke it yet, something unspoken was building between them, stronger than the walls of the cabin and deeper than the land outside. The fire in the cabin burned low, throwing soft orange light across the wooden walls. Outside, the prairie was quiet, the sky heavy with stars. Inside, Daniel sat at the small table, his hat resting nearby, his rough hands folded in front of him. Across from him, Ayanna moved slowly, placing another log on the fire. For weeks now, they had lived in an uneasy peace. She worked with quiet care, cooking, mending, and helping on the ranch. He worked long hours in the fields and with the cattle, always aware of the stares in town whenever he went for supplies. But tonight felt different. The silence between them carried weight. Daniel noticed the way Ayanna's eyes avoided his, the way her hands trembled slightly as she sat back down. She seemed to be holding something inside, something she had kept hidden since the night he first carried her from the dry riverbed. At last, she spoke. Her voice was low, filled with both fear and hope. "Daniel, let me stay here, please. I'll give you what no white woman can." The words hung in the air. Daniel froze. He had expected many things. Perhaps a thank you, perhaps a confession about why her own people had turned her away. But not this. He looked at her carefully, his eyes steady, his jaw tight. "What do you mean by that?" he asked after a moment. Ayanna's hands twisted in her lap. She seemed to search for words, her English not strong enough to carry the depth of her heart. Still, she tried. "I don't mean gold. Not pretty clothes, not soft life. Her voice broke slightly. Then she lifted her eyes, meeting his with surprising strength. I mean loyalty. I know the land, the wind, the storms. I know how to fight for life when it's hard. White women maybe give you comfort, but I can give you my strength, my soul. Daniel sat back, her words striking deeper than he expected. He had lived among settlers all his life. He had seen women in town, some polite, some distant, some whispering behind fans. He had never thought much about marrying. His life had been too rough, too quiet. And now here was this woman, cast out, wounded, yet offering him something he had never heard before. But his thoughts tangled with doubt. If you stay here, it won't be easy, he said finally. People talk. Some might do worse than talk. You'll bring trouble on yourself, and on me. Ayana's eyes filled with tears, but they did not fall. Instead, her voice grew firm. I have already lived with trouble, alone, no home, no family. I would rather face their words with you than face silence by myself. Daniel looked away, staring into the fire. He could not deny the truth in her words. He had lived in silence too long to pretend it was easy. He knew the ache of empty nights, the loneliness of returning to a cabin with no voice but his own to break the quiet. And now in these weeks he had felt that silence slowly lift. Ayana's presence, even in her quiet ways, had given life back to his home. Still, the world outside his cabin walls was harsh. He leaned forward, speaking low. Ayana, you don't know these people. They'll call you names. They'll try to make me send you away. If I choose you, I may lose trade, maybe even friends. She did not flinch. Then let them. If they cannot see truth, let them turn away. You must choose your heart, not their voices. Daniel studied her for a long time. In her dark eyes he saw fire, not the fire of anger, but of courage. She was not begging out of weakness. She was standing in her own way, offering him something rare, a bond built not on wealth or status, but on shared struggle. The days that followed were heavy with this new weight between them. Ayana worked as always, but Daniel noticed how her eyes searched his face for answers. He spoke little, yet inside he was restless. Each trip into town sharpened the question in his mind. Harris, the loud rancher, smirked openly when Daniel passed. Got yourself some wild company, eh, cowboy? He jeered one morning. Others laughed, though uneasily. Daniel said nothing, but the words cut deep. That night, Daniel returned home to find Ayana waiting by the fire. She had prepared food, but her hands shook as she placed the plate in front of him. Finally, she whispered, Do you regret helping me? Daniel set his fork down. He looked at her, seeing not just her fear, but her strength hidden beneath it. No, he said firmly. I don't regret it. Not one bit. Relief softened her face, and for a moment the cabin seemed warmer, but life outside was not done testing them. One evening, riders passed near the ranch. Their laughter carried across the prairie, rough and mocking. Daniel stood at the door, watching shadows move against the horizon. Ayana stood behind him, her hand lightly touching his arm. She did not speak, but he felt her steady presence, unshaken even in the face of threat. Later, by the fire, Ayana finally shared more of her story. Her words came slowly, each one carrying pain. My people. They turned from me. I chose a path they did not want. I would not marry the man chosen. So I was left, cast away. She lifted her chin as if daring him to judge her. Daniel did not. Instead, he listened in silence. Her honesty only deepened his respect. She had chosen freedom, even at the cost of her home. As the days stretched on, Daniel began to see her not as someone he had rescued, but as someone who had rescued him from his own emptiness. She worked beside him in the fields, her hands rough from labor but steady. She guided him to hidden water sources during dry spells, showed him plants that could heal wounds, and taught him to read the sky in ways he had never known. The bond between them grew, not with sudden passion, but with quiet strength. Each shared glance, each unspoken word carried meaning. Yet in the back of Daniel's mind, the pressure of the outside world remained. He knew the townsfolk would not stop whispering. Some might one day come to his door, but he also knew something else. His life was no longer just his own. It was tied now to Ayana, to her strength, her loyalty, her unbroken spirit. One evening, as the sun sank red across the hills, Daniel found her standing by the corral, watching Clara graze. He walked up beside her, silent for a long while. Then he said quietly, You asked to stay. You told me what you could give. I haven't answered yet. Ayanna turned to him, her face calm but her eyes searching his. Daniel nodded slowly. You can stay. Whatever comes, we'll face it together. For the first time since he had met her, Ayanna's face broke into a true smile. It was not just relief, it was joy, deep and real. She reached for his hand, and he let her take it, their fingers locking together under the fading sky. In that moment, Daniel knew he had chosen more than just companionship. He had chosen courage. The courage to walk against the whispers of the world, and the courage to build a life with someone who had been cast aside, yet carried more strength than most he had ever known. The prairie stretched on wide and endless. The town might talk, neighbors might sneer, but in the quiet of his ranch, Daniel found something the world could not touch, a bond that promised to stand strong no matter the storm. The days passed quickly and summer heat pressed down hard on the prairie. Daniel and Ayanna settled into a steady rhythm on the ranch. Every morning he rose early to check the cattle, while she prepared food and cared for the small garden she had started beside the cabin. In the evenings they would sit together near the fire, sometimes in silence, sometimes sharing stories in broken words, piecing together each other's worlds little by little. But peace on the prairie was never lasting. Trouble always had a way of finding its path across the wide land. One late afternoon, as Daniel was mending a fence near the far edge of his pasture, he noticed the cattle shifting nervously. The herd snorted, their ears twitching, and they began to bunch together as if sensing something unseen. Daniel straightened, wiping the sweat from his brow, and scanned the horizon. Dust rose in the distance, more than a lone rider would stir. His gut tightened. He knew the sign. Riders were coming, and not friendly ones. He mounted Clara quickly and rode back toward the cabin. As he approached, Ayanna stepped out, holding a basket of herbs she had been drying. She saw his face and knew at once something was wrong. What is it? She asked quickly. Raiders, Daniel said, his voice grim. Could be cattle thieves. Could be worse. But they're coming. Ayanna's eyes flashed, not with fear, but with a sharp awareness. She set the basket down and stood tall. How many? Too many for me alone, Daniel admitted. Maybe 6, maybe more. He didn't expect her next words. Then we fight smart, not hard. Daniel stared at her. She spoke with the calm of someone who had faced danger before. What do you mean? She motioned toward the rocky ridge that overlooked the pasture. The land can be your shield. They will not know it like I do. We use it. For a moment, Daniel hesitated. He had always worked alone, relying on his own strength. But looking at Ayanna, he saw certainty in her face. She was not a burden, she was a partner. He gave a short nod. All right. Show me. Together they hurried to prepare. Ayanna guided him to where the ground dipped near the creek bed. She explained how the raiders would likely come fast, focused on the cattle, not watching their flanks. Daniel set a trap of loose wire near the corral gate, while Ayanna gathered dry brush to create sudden smoke if they needed to confuse the riders. The sun dipped lower, shadows stretching across the land. Then the sound came, hoofbeats, rough laughter carried by the wind. Daniel gripped his rifle, his heart steady but heavy. Ayanna crouched beside him, her eyes sharp, her hands ready with a torch she had made from cloth and pitch. The riders burst into view, shouting and waving their guns. They tried to push the cattle, but the herd stampeded in confusion, blocked by Daniel's fence and startled by the sudden smoke Ayanna lit near the corral. The raiders cursed and pulled back, their horses rearing at the unexpected chaos. Daniel took aim and fired a warning shot, the bullet striking the dirt close to the lead rider. "This is my land," he shouted, his voice carrying across the field. "Turn back or you'll regret it." But raiders were not known for retreating at words. 2 of them broke off, riding fast toward the cabin, likely thinking to scare Ayanna. But she did not run. She swung her torch and threw it into the brush she had piled earlier. Flames rose suddenly, startling the horses and forcing the men to pull back. Daniel watched in surprise and pride. She had not only stood her ground, but turned the land itself into a weapon. The fight stretched into the night. The raiders tried again and again to press closer, but Daniel and Ayanna stayed one step ahead, driving them back with clever traps and quick thinking. At last, frustrated and beaten by the fire, the smoke, and the stubborn defense, the riders cursed loudly and turned their horses toward the hills. Vanishing into the darkness, silence returned, broken only by the crackle of fading flames and the restless lowing of cattle. Daniel lowered his rifle. his chest heaving from both effort and relief. Ayanna stepped beside him, her face smudged with ash, her hair tangled by the wind but her eyes bright with victory. "You saved the herd," Daniel said, his voice rough with emotion. "You saved the ranch," she shook her head. "We saved it. Together." For a moment they stood there in the quiet night, the firelight flickering around them. Daniel felt a surge of respect so deep it left him silent. All his life he had believed strength meant standing alone. But Ayanna had shown him another kind of strength. The strength of trust, of partnership, of seeing the land not as an enemy, but as an ally. When they returned to the cabin, exhaustion weighed on them both. Daniel poured water into a basin and Ayanna washed the soot from her hands. She looked at him then, her voice soft but firm. "Now you see, I can fight beside you. I can guard what you guard. I can give you what no one else will." Daniel's throat tightened. Her words from nights ago came rushing back, the promise that she would give him what no white woman could. He understood them now, not as a boast, but as truth. Her loyalty was fierce, her courage unshaken, her bond to him unbreakable. He reached out, resting his rough hand gently on hers. "You were right," he said simply. "I see it now." In her eyes he saw gratitude, but also something deeper, a hope that perhaps she had finally found a place where she belonged. The next days were filled with repair. Daniel and Ayanna worked side by side, mending fences, calming the cattle, clearing the burned brush. Neighbors who passed by noticed the damage and asked questions, but Daniel gave only short answers. He didn't mention Ayanna's role, though the truth burned proudly in his heart. One afternoon Harris rode by, his eyes sharp and mocking as always. "Heard you had some trouble," he drawled. "Strange thing, though, trouble always seems to follow when you've got strange company around." Daniel's jaw tightened, but before he could speak, Ayanna stepped out of the cabin carrying a bucket. She stood tall, her face calm, and met Harris's stare without fear. Harris shifted uncomfortably under her steady gaze, muttered something, and rode off. Daniel watched her, pride swelling in his chest. She was not afraid of whispers or stares. She had faced fire, raiders, and rejection from her own people. Now she stood firm beside him, unshaken. That night, as they sat by the fire, Daniel finally spoke what had been resting on his heart. "Ayanna, I don't care what the town says. I don't care what anyone thinks. You belong here, with me." Her eyes filled with tears, but this time they were not from sorrow. She placed her hand over his, her voice steady. "Then I will stay, and together we will face whatever comes." The prairie outside was wide and wild, filled with dangers that could come any day. But inside that small cabin, there was a bond stronger than fear, stronger than gossip, stronger even than the loneliness that had once ruled Daniel's life. For the first time, he did not feel like a man walking the land alone. He felt like part of something greater, a partnership born not from convenience but from courage, loyalty, and choice. The days after the raid carried a strange quiet across the prairie. The cattle grazed peacefully again, the fences stood firm, and the ranch seemed almost untouched by the chaos that had swept through it. But inside Daniel's cabin, something had changed forever. The bond between him and Ayanna had deepened, tested by fire and danger, and now it felt unshakable. Daniel rose each morning with a new sense of purpose. The silence that once weighed heavily on him now felt alive, filled with the soft sounds of Ayanna preparing food, humming while she worked, or tending the small garden by the door. The cabin no longer felt empty. It felt like a home. One evening, as they sat together by the fire, Daniel looked across at her. She was sewing a patch on one of his old coats, her fingers moving with care. He thought of the words she had spoken weeks ago. "Let me stay here, and I'll give you what no white woman can." At the time, those words had startled him. Now he understood. She had given him loyalty, courage, and a sense of belonging that he had never known. But the world outside was not blind. Whispers in town grew louder. Harris and others spoke more boldly, warning Daniel that his choices would cost him. "You keep that Apache woman out there," Harris sneered one afternoon at the store, "and you'll find no help from us when you need it." Daniel did not answer. He only bought what he needed and left. But the words echoed in his mind as he rode home. When he reached the cabin, he found Ayanna waiting by the corral, brushing Clara's coat. She smiled faintly when she saw him, but her eyes searched his face, reading the weight he carried. They spoke again. She asked softly, Yes, Daniel admitted. They don't understand. Ayana set the brush down. They will not understand. But do you? Daniel stepped closer, looking at her straight on. I do. And that's all that matters. Her lips curved into a small smile, relief and trust shining in her eyes. In that moment, Daniel knew he had made his choice long ago, the night he first carried her from the dry riverbed. He had chosen her whether he had spoken it or not. Life on the ranch continued. Together they worked the land, cared for the cattle, and faced each day side by side. Ayana taught Daniel more about the land, how to track animals by the faintest signs, how to find medicine in plants he once thought were weeds, how to listen to the wind as if it carried messages. Daniel in turn showed her the tools of ranching, how to rope cattle, how to mend fences, how to work with neighbors when trade was needed. Though challenges never ended, they faced them as one. One afternoon, weeks later, a storm rolled in across the plains. The sky turned dark, thunder rumbling like drums in the distance. Daniel and Ayana rushed to gather the cattle, working side by side as rain began to fall in sheets. Clara struggled against the wind, but Ayana steadied her, guiding the horse with calm words. Together they brought the herd back to shelter, soaked to the bone but laughing with relief when it was over. Inside the cabin, dripping wet, they sat by the fire, their clothes steaming as they dried. Ayana looked at him, her dark hair clinging to her face, and whispered, "Do you see now? Alone you could not fight storm raiders' whispers, but together we can." Daniel reached for her hand, his voice firm. "I see it now. I'll never forget it." The days turned into months. In town, some people still whispered, still judged, but others began to see Daniel's quiet strength, his steady work, and the peace he kept on his land. Slowly, some stopped speaking against him. The prairie had a way of teaching people that survival mattered more than gossip. Yet even if the town never accepted Ayana fully, Daniel no longer cared. His ranch was not built on their approval. It was built on the bond he shared with her, a bond of loyalty, courage, and love born from hardship. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky with streaks of orange and pink, Daniel and Ayana stood together on the ridge overlooking the pasture. The cattle grazed calmly below. The wind carried the smell of grass and earth, and the world seemed wide and open before them. Ayana turned to him, her eyes reflecting the colors of the sky. "Do you regret?" she asked softly. Daniel shook his head slowly, his gaze steady on her. "No, not for a single moment. You were right that night. You've given me something no one else ever could. You've given me strength and a life worth living." Tears filled her eyes, but they were not of sorrow. They were of peace, of belonging. She leaned into him, and for the first time in many years, Daniel felt whole. The prairie stretched wide, endless and untamed, filled with dangers and storms yet to come. But Daniel no longer feared them. With Ayana by his side, he knew he could face whatever the land or the world threw at them. The cowboy who had once lived in silence and loneliness had found his partner. And the Apache woman who had once begged for a place to stay had found not just shelter, but a home, a purpose, and a man who saw her for who she truly was. Together, they walked back toward the cabin as the last light faded. Their shadows stretched long across the grass, two figures bound not by chance but by choice, courage, and the quiet promise of forever.